Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 75. Once upon a time, being radical meant throwing yourself fully into one-sided politics. Think Rush Limbaugh on the right or Keith Olbermann on the left. Loud, partisan, polarizing voices that stood out because they were willing to go to the extreme. But today, that kind of partisanship isn't radical at all. It's predictable. It's the script everyone's following. Now, when we talk about being radical in this episode, we don't mean it in a way you often hear it, like the radical left or radical right, used as an insult or to describe militant factions of the 1960s. Instead, here, radical means something different, brave, punk, willing to push against the grain. We're talking about challenging conventional wisdom and embracing bold new ideas. And in today's political climate, if you really want to be radical, you do something difficult. Resist the pull of the tribe. Be independent. Split your ticket. Take a position your own side doesn't like. In a landscape where the parties have drifted further and further apart, maybe the true radicals are the ones who refuse to walk lockstep with the tribe. The ones who don't fit neatly into a red or blue box. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and that's what we'll explore in this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, with someone at the heart of the independent voter movement.
My name is Lura Forcum. I'm the president of the Independent Center. I have a PhD in consumer psychology, and I actually spent about 8 years as a marketing professor at Clemson University. So I bring a little bit of a different perspective to this work. But the thing that really motivates me and drives me in this work is I want the most people possible to engage in policy conversations about what we think is important and what we value as a country and how we want to use our resources to get those things. And so the reason I did a PhD in the first place was because I wanted to understand how you can bring people into conversation about complex policy topics. And one of the things that the Independent Center is trying to do is get people who currently don't feel like they have a political home to engage in politics. I think that representation is really important for our health as a country and as individuals. So that's what I do.
The Independent Center is an organization dedicated to empowering independent voters, the millions of Americans who no longer feel like the major political parties represent their views or concerns. They feel politically homeless. We'll talk about who they are, what they believe, and why this movement could reshape our democracy right now with Lura Forcum. Lura Forcum, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
So I've been looking forward to this. I know I messed up last time and something happened. I can't remember what, and I had to cancel. So I really appreciate you accommodating us and rescheduling. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you, so I'm happy to reschedule.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit before about this idea of maybe digging deeper on this idea of the center being radical. Is that what's radical now? So I guess, before I go completely into that, I want to talk just a little bit about what we even mean by the center, right? Like, is it a list of policies? Is it a temperament? Is it a process, a mindset? Maybe you can help us kind of just understand that.
Well, the way we look at the center is not so much their positions, but kind of what is left behind as the parties continue to drift further away from each other. And so you get this bigger and bigger kind of chunk of voters who are, you could represent them in the center in the sense that they no longer feel like the parties represent their views. They're not a center in the sense that they all agree on everything. They're a center in the sense that their views have stayed the same and the party's policies and positions have continued to sort of migrate away. And so I think they actually have a bunch of characteristics that to me suggest there's something very different about them. There's something actually kind of radical in your language about them.
Yeah, well, I mean, that certainly is consistent with, I'm sure, the work that you've seen with like the exhausted majority idea
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. And it seems consistent with that a large percent, and it's also consistent with sort of the number of people that identify as independents and how that's been growing, and people using this
Mhm.
language like being, sort of feeling homeless.
I hear that from people a lot.
Yeah. So one of the challenges of these kind of nonpartisan movements, they can sort of lack this shared ideology part, and there can be all the sort of infrastructure pieces like funding and machinery that the political parties have. So how does the Independent Center plan to overcome those kind of structural disadvantages?
Yeah, I just want to be really clear. Like, we're not trying to create a political party. We are trying to create a movement of people who feel like politics can be better, that it needs to be more representative, um, and that it's not unreasonable to expect elected officials to be accountable for what they've said they're going to accomplish. And really, I don't think partisans are very effective at accountability, which makes sense, right? Because if the person on your side doesn't deliver on policies, or doesn't, have the kind of character you expect from an elected official, if you are a dyed in the wool Democrat or Republican, you're not going to cross the aisle to vote this person out of office, right? You're just going to kind of justify it and say, well, at least they're not the other party. But these nonpartisan independent voters are actually a really effective force for accountability, because they look at campaign promises and they say, okay, that's what you said you're going to do. Did you deliver? And if you didn't deliver, you don't continue to get their support. And so I think, that's radical in our current political environment, is actually holding elected officials accountable and saying, oh, you didn't do the things that I said were important. And so we're going, I'm not going to continue to support you. Um, that's one reason why I think it's really important to distinguish that we're not trying to compete with parties, because, as you mentioned, they're extremely well resourced. They have decades of the kind of experience in the law, and also arranging the laws in their favor, right? Which we just don't have. Like, I don't know that we can beat them at their own game. So we're not trying to have an impact as a third party. What we're trying to do is speak to voters who look at our current political environment and say, there's no place there for me. I don't have a home. And say to them, yeah, we know you don't feel like you belong in one of these parties, but you do belong in political engagement. And your political participation is really important for democracy and for how our country functions. We need your voice represented in politics. And so we want them to get the message that they belong in politics as voters and as candidates too, because what they are hearing all the time from the parties is that they don't belong in politics. Like, if you listen to the rhetoric from the parties, it's, you guys are spoilers. These are undecided, uninformed voters. And when they figure it out, they'll come home to a party, right? It's incredibly dismissive. And so we're trying to counter that messaging by saying, no, you guys are what we need in politics. You are great for politics. When I talk to independent voters, I am routinely struck by how deeply informed they are about issues, and how they want to have these trade-off conversations about what would good policymaking look like for immigration reform, immigration modernization, entitlement reform and modernization, right? Like, they are actually thinking really deeply, and those are the exact people that we want to engage in politics.
Well, and there I think you've highlighted a bunch of the aspects that make them or that kind of a movement radical. Is one, sort of those cross-cutting ideas, willing to break
Mm-hmm.
from a party, and two is looking at things, being more analytical about it, and trying to, yeah. So I think those are some big pieces there that make this a pretty radical movement, right? Or
Yeah.
potentially anyway. And I'm going to jump to that, kind of follow up on that then a little bit out of order, the order I was going to go in, because I mentioned before this idea that the number of, or the data that shows that the number of Americans that identify as independents has been going up, and I think it now outnumbers both Democrats and Republicans, if I'm not wrong
Hmm.
on that.
Yes.
And but then when you drill down on that a little bit, what the political science research shows is that most of those that self-identify as independent maybe are a little bit more of this homeless idea, but they usually lean one way or the other and tend to vote,
Hmm.
you know, like a Democrat most of the time or like a Republican most of the time. Um, they sometimes call them sort of closet partisans.
Hmm.
And so is what you're seeing when you were talking about the independents that you're talking to, do you think there's something that's sort of goes beyond that and is maybe I don't know, is that or maybe another way to ask this is this sort of an obstacle maybe to creating a sort of a genuinely independent movement?
So, one of the things that I try to make sure that I say whenever I'm doing a podcast or talking about independence is that what the Independence Center is talking about is not solely the people who vote third party, it's also people who swing vote and split ticket vote. Right. So I would just describe these are nonpartisan voters, right? Like they may tend toward one side or the other, but they are not deeply ideologically aligned with one party. And so, the point that you hear sometimes in political science research, which is like, hey, these guys don't seem to exist. They don't show up and vote for people with eyes after their names. Um, I look at that as kind of a red herring, right? Because it's like, well, yeah, the rules of the game are stacked against these people having choice and candidates to vote for. So when you're like, well, they're not voting for independence, I'm like, well, you won't let an independent run. How do we know what they like? I think we spend a lot of time looking at the electoral tea leaves, right? And looking at a choice between two elderly white men, wealthy white men, right? And saying, gee, voters must really love these elderly rich white men. And it's like, well, no, they don't. That's just the only thing that's there for them to choose from. Like, how can we say anything about what their preferences are when there's so little competition? So I think like trying to say, here's what voters are really like with this extremely constrained universe of candidates is just kind of a fool's errand, right? And it doesn't surprise me that the two parties look at their data. I mean, I kind of joke that they're like drunks looking for their car keys under the spotlight, right? They're like, gee, we're looking at our data and we don't see any evidence of independence. And it's like, I don't think you're really motivated to see what independents want. They're so busy dismissing independents as not fundamentally engaged in politics instead of trying to understand what is motivating these voters and how can we reach them. And that's worked really well as long as they could keep us enough voters registered to be able to win and hold office, right? But especially in the presidency, what we see now is you can't win without winning over independents. And we actually think that's a really positive force for democracy because what will happen is if you have to court these voters and offer them the things that are important to them in order to win, it's going to pull both parties back towards the center, right? Because it won't be enough to just deal with your base voters. You're going to have to get these people in the middle and speak to their needs and their concerns in order to win elected office.
Well, and I want to talk about that a little bit because when you talk about pulling people to the middle, that's what a lot of people put as a criticism
Mm-hmm.
of centrism, right? That it's kind of both sidesism, or it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of a split the difference between extremes rather than offering, sort of a real integrated vision. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in the analysis that we do, we plot these voters, and we're not the only ones doing this, right? Like we plot these voters on a 2 by 2 space, right? So you get 4 quadrants instead of just a left-right space. So that's one way of sort of saying, well, there's more than one dimension of political values, and just speaking in a purely like left-right sense is probably leaving out some nuance that's important. And in terms of like whether these voters represent the mushy middle, like you've talked about, and like we hear from a lot of people. Um, it's interesting to me that that's so off-putting to so many people. I kind of look at that as a really odd political criticism. It seems to be more about ideology policing than it really is about concerns about what would be wrong with voters who say, I don't feel really strongly about how we fix entitlements, but I would like you to do something to fix entitlements. Um, so another point, though, where we're talking about this left-right divide is what we would say is that these are voters, and this is where the left-right thing really starts to break down, right? Because these are a lot of voters who have values that don't really fit in either party currently, right? So one of the values that we see a lot in our research is that the nonpartisan voters are extremely tolerant of diversity and differences of values and behaviors, right? And I think traditionally that's been seen as a democratic position, but I think in recent years, like that's starting, the Democrats are having a little bit of trouble really holding that line, right? Because they're sort of they have tolerance for some groups of people and not others, right? They don't have a lot of tolerance for conservative Christians or evangelicals. So is that really tolerance? Right. And what we're seeing from the folks in our research is these are people who want to live and let wit live. They're okay with differences in values and behaviors, um, to the extent that it's not harmful for other people. The other thing we see a lot from these voters is that they have concerns about the country's fiscal health. And again, traditional Republican talking point, I don't think I would agree at this point that Republicans are the party of fiscal responsibility, right? They're performing some fiscal related policy making, but um, you know, they're continuing to add to the deficit at a really rapid rate. So when we say these guys are just the middle, it's like, well, not exactly, right? And these aren't values that are the center of two extremes, right? They're kind of being missed by both political parties. So I actually think the independents as nonpartisan, as nonpartisans are actually a more natural form of self-governing because independents are looking at the two parties and saying, what you guys are doing is ineffective. It's not representing what we want. And so like we can't support either of you. We're asking you to govern effectively, not come up with a list of what you have to do to be in the club. And so when people are sort of wagging their finger, and I hear this all the time lately, I hear about people saying like, oh, well, they're kind of squishy. I'm really curious about where that critique is coming from. How did we create a political environment where like the primary value is to have perfect ideological alignment? That's not a democratic value. Like that's not pluralism. And this is a pluralistic country.
Yeah, I mean that again, we're sort of there's the radical thing again, right? Doing those cross-cutting, doing something outside what your tribe says. And when you talk about it not being democratic, but it is very human, right? I mean, because that's
Hmm.
kind of our psychology. We've talked a lot about that on this show, and I'm sure you're aware of a lot of this. So if I'm going to take one of these positions, like you were just talking about being called
Hmm.
squishy or whatever, if I'm in a group with my peers and I say, wait, I don't think that. I don't necessarily agree with that thing. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, you're going to be like, what are you MAGA or something? Whatever, right? You're going to
Hmm.
be accused of something. And it can be really hard because that's very painful, right? That can really hurt if you get kicked out of your tribe. So there's all the
Yeah.
psychology side of that and all the pressures there, which means that you have to have that courage. You have to be radical and have that courage to
Yes.
do it. But there's also all the structural stuff, and you've also hinted about that, right? I mean, you've got all these electoral systems that are built around
Hmm.
built around parties. And, what is it? It takes like, a tiny amount of votes to be added as a Democratic candidate. It takes like the massive amount of signatures
Yes.
to be added as an independent, this kind of thing, right? The barriers and the hurdles are just ridiculous right now. So,
Mhm.
so how do you see the independent center's role and maybe changing some of those deep, you probably can't do a lot about the human psyche, although I guess there's cultural changes we could work on. But, is the center looking at doing anything in these sort of structural things, the electoral systems and other, maybe even media reforms?
Yeah, when people ask me about things like primary reform or media incentives, and gerrymandering and term limits, like those are all fantastic things that I think we should pursue. But to me, those become possible as we get more representative politics, right? Like those are the kind of reforms that you could get if you elected a handful of members of the House of Representatives who are independents. You could stop either side from having a majority, and then those independents could say, you know what, we are going to insist that we look at Social Security reform. We're going to insist that we look at term limits. We're going to insist that we look at, gerrymandering, right? And so I think that that's a a route that's much more available to us than trying to convince members of Congress to police themselves on things like, their insider trading and term limits, right? Like the inmates are running the asylum. They're not going to do this unless we make them. And in our point of view, the best way we have to make them be more responsive is to enfranchise independent voters. So we certainly support reforms like open primaries would make it easier to have political competition. But some of the other ways we try to impact the system is by helping independents figure out what they need to do to vote. Because as you mentioned, every state has a different, it's not quite 50 different setups for how independents vote. But in some states, if you register as independent, you can't vote in the party primary. And so we want people to have the information they need in order to make a decision. Because maybe you live in a state where registering as an independent means you can't vote in either party's primary. And in that case, you might say, you know what, I really want to be able to influence the Republican primary. So I'm going to register as a Republican because that's important to me. We just want people to have the information they need to make informed decisions about what political participation is meaningful to them. If and so we're not here to like get people to put eyes after their name or to even say, hey, you got to vote for people with eyes after their name. What we're trying to say is you belong in political participation. Here are resources to help you figure out how your values match up to different policy issues and different candidates. But we're not here to tell independents like this is how you need to vote or this is what you need to do.
So right now you don't have like a issue platform or something that you put out.
We No, we don't have a platform the way a party would. We tend to present information in a way that is different from the two parties. And I think a lot of the times independents are frustrated with political discourse because it's like you end up with these absurd conversations, right? Like you have Democrats saying, hey, climate change is probably something we should do something about. And then you have Republicans saying, nope, there's no such thing as climate change, right? And so you end up with this insane conversation that doesn't do anything to understand or address the underlying issue. And so what we try to do is on whatever policy issue is being discussed, present information like here's the two party positions, and then here's the way that experts are looking at this issue and provide information that you're not going to get from other sources because in most cases we are really talking about two very oversimplistic ways of looking at the policy issue. I think we're looking at that with the immigration system right now, which is incredibly broken, which could be reformed in a way that would safely let in guest workers, know where they are, have them have protections, right? Have them not be hiding in the shadows, collect taxes from them. And we could fix the system with those goals in mind, but instead it's just a political football, right? Like you have Democrats saying this is all fine, we don't need to do anything about it, and you have Republicans saying let's round up people and ask them for their papers and then fly them to another country where they've never been before as a form of deportation, right? Like these are two completely insane proposals to a problem that's affecting everyday Americans. So we're trying to have a conversation about what good policy would look like, and not say we're pro-immigration or anti-immigration. Immigration is a reality that that is currently a massive problem because we have a very broken immigration system and a political system with no incentive to address it.
Right. I mean, I think it reminds me of a word you used early on in our conversation, which is trade-offs, right? I mean, all of these things
Mm-hmm.
in real life, they don't have a, sort of good and bad, right? They are every decision you're going to make about something like this is some kind of a trade-off. And I've for a long time looked at immigration as the oddest one that's become so politicized because it seems like one of the ones that has so many opportunities for sort of a set of for integrating values from both parties, right? From
Mm-hmm.
and actually having, you're still going to find around the edges, you're going to find arguments in those trade-offs, right? But yeah, I mean, the idea that it's become as politicized as it is a super. Like you say, it's an outcome of the type of political system we have now, where as soon as they can make something political, they will, because it's just all the incentives work for that, right? If I can make it a black and white
Mm-hmm.
issue that's either my tribe or your tribe, pick a side, then that's just so much easier for these politicians, right? So all these
Mm-hmm.
candidates and all their political messaging, it simplifies all that. Talking about how can independents maybe have some impact here? Like if there is a way, like that 40%, whatever the number is, it's pretty large.
Mm-hmm.
If they already are obviously a force. I mean, people do care about
Mm-hmm.
where independents are in the polling and things like that. But if that can really start to cause, a sense that there'll be more accountability towards things that align with their actual responsibilities, rather than, for the most part, when we're doing the tribal accountability, it's mostly about their performance, right? It's about theater. Like, do they win debates, and
Mm-hmm.
did they own the libs and all this kind of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Are they an avatar or an exemplar for my party that I will rally behind? And in some ways, it's like very regressive, right? Like it is very tribal. It's not consensus building and consensus making and shared values and trade-offs and conversation the way I think that we all do in other aspects of our lives. That's
right,
the other thing that I think troubles a lot of independents, a lot of these nonpartisans, because they're sort of like, you know what? I don't agree with all of my neighbors. I don't agree with all of my friends. I don't agree with all of my colleagues. But at the end of the day, we find a way to work together because we have other goals we're pursuing. Yet somehow politics has created this alternate reality for itself where it doesn't have to accomplish anything. And yeah, you win by yelling on Twitter.
right.
Like it's not governing. Whatever that is, it's not governing. Governing is a really complex set of skills. Legislating is complicated. And going back to the immigration issue, if you actually talk to people who are policy experts on immigration, they have some incredibly interesting ideas. And a lot of the things that seem intuitively like they might work turn out in practice to not work so well. And we can't discover any of these things if we're just going to call people names on social media. And I
Yeah,
don't mean voters, I mean the elected
right,
officials.
right. Well, and then, like you say, we reward them when they do it, right?
Hmm.
So we do have a
Yep.
role in
Here's the
this.
money.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, maybe that's another place where independents can role model this other behavior, and say, look, I said a thing that was kind of against the tribe I kind of somewhat align with. And look, my life
Mhm.
didn't end. I'm okay. I'm still here. Things like
Yeah, I
that.
think yeah, I think like modeling that and saying like here's what it looks like to be a nonpartisan voter. I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is really important and just from my background as a psychologist is that where you have a strong identity, that is what is makes behavior follow along most closely, right? So when I have an identity that I am a certain type of parent or that I am a person who thinks it's important to give back to my community. My identity is that I take care of my body, right? Like that's where I have a really strong linkage and my behaviors around those identities become really predictable. And so what we're trying to do is help people have an identity that says, I can engage politically without being a partisan. Because, and I mentioned this earlier, the message independents are constantly getting is that they don't belong in politics, that they're spoilers, right? And that they're just uninformed voters. And not that it couldn't be further from the truth. I'm just routinely um, amazed and impressed with the amount of information that independents are bringing to their political decision making.
Hmm. Well, let's take that sort of to the next step. So we've talked a lot about some of the obstacles, but I know that you sort of believe in this radical center idea. So what gives you some hope that this movement can succeed despite like all those obstacles? And what would sort of America look like if things align with that vision or your vision?
Mhm. So I think American functions best as a democracy where we can get as many people's viewpoints as possible represented in our political process. I think some of the volatility and violence that we're seeing crop up in our politics right now are coming from people feeling incredibly disempowered. They feel like life is happening to them. They don't have any impact on them. And I think that that is a byproduct of having, 27% of voters identify as Republicans and 27% identify as Democrats, right? It's just that like that leaves the bulk of Americans out of political representation. Um, and so, to me, this is not just a question of isn't it nice for everybody to have a vote? It's really like, is the system delivering what voters need in a way that makes them feel like they have agency over their lives so that they can be engaged in a productive way of living instead of feeling like they have no control and like, who cares, burn it all down. Right. And I think we're seeing some of that political nihilism with with some of the like more extreme views that you're hearing from both the left and the right politically. Right. It's just people who say, oh, it's all corrupt. It's all corrupt anyway. Like, who cares? Um, and I don't think that's good for the system as a whole. I don't think it's good for individuals to feel that disempowered. So I am hopeful that we can create this identity to really like insist politics functions, and that govern or that elected officials are responsive to what voters want. And I think there's a lot of reasons to kind of think that especially younger generations of voters might prefer an independent identity rather than a partisan identity. And it has to do with kind of how they look at labels and how they kind of choose to ally themselves with organizations and groups. It's a really interesting shift where like the baby boomer era, the baby boomer generation, like those are individuals, and there's lots of evidence in marketing from this. Those were like the most brand loyal consumers. They're the ones who are like, oh, I'm a Ford guy. We always buy Fords, right? Like they're very loyal to a particular store. Younger generations of Americans aren't like that, and so rather than seeing that as like disloyal behavior, how I see it is these are not these are people who are less likely to derive meaning from joining a group and to instead kind of want to weigh a decision more carefully and say, what makes me feel understood as a political identity? And so what they're telling us right now with this 43% independent is neither of those parties help people understand who I am as a person. And I think that's why they're not putting on that mantle, right? They're not wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt. So I think they have a really different way of joining lots of different groups. It's not just brand loyalty, right? It's like, are you going to be a member of a church? Are you a member of a civic group, right? Like a lot of that is starting to decrease. And so I think these are people who are just relating differently to political identities than older generations. So I think there's a sea change in how people are thinking about political engagement.
Interesting. Well, I mean, a lot of the political scientists that I've talked to sort of talk about this, that if there starts to be, a sort of a consensus type view among these independents, they'll sort of just, those views and those policy positions will then just sort of get absorbed into the parties, which I guess maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, I think ideally what you would want to see happen is the parties trying to develop the capability of understanding those independent voters and then delivering policies and politicians, candidates who match what they're looking for. Like that, to me, that's the ideal state, right? Like I want the parties to be responsive to the voters. But what you have with this duopoly is the opposite of that, right? Is like the two of them actually can be quite bipartisan when it comes to agreeing that they don't care to have any political competition. And that competition is what would actually force them to be responsive. But what they're able to do right now is kind of create an equilibrium where neither of them have to move. And I think they've pretty much reached the end of the runway of how long you can sort of say to voters, like, no, we're not, you'll come to us. We're not going to you. And as somebody, so my academic career was in marketing, and as somebody working in marketing, like how we describe that function within a business is the ability to understand consumer needs and bring that information into the firm and help the firm figure out how to meet those needs with products, right? That's not happening in politics for a lot of different reasons. But I think a big part of it is that they don't perceive that there's a need to understand this big swath of independent voters because they're very busy explaining why these people don't matter. And I think they're believing their own talking points, but you can't, independents delivered the election to Trump. And in the election before that, they swung for Biden. So I get why the parties are kind of dismissing them as fickle, but the political reality is you're going to have to speak to them in order to win the next presidential election.
Right. Well, Lura Forcum, thank you so much for making time for us again. I really appreciate those insights.
Thanks, David. I enjoyed chatting.
Before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to a podcast friend. This isn't an ad, just a friend whose show I think you might enjoy. Here's a short promo.
Are you tired of all the arguments that get you absolutely nowhere? My name's Jurgs. With my degree in history and political science and 21 years as a special agent in the U.S. Secret Service, I've lived what other political pundits can only talk about. Join me weekdays, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 Pacific, and then again on the podcast for Up the Middle, Politics for the Rest of Us. Daily show is available at www.mastiff.media. The podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.